A toddler's head was trapped between the plastic doors, and the father jumped into action.
Parkway riders say a new gate system designed to reduce fare evasion.
Oh, they got him! Let me try to help you. Oh, no,
This starts with something everyone in New York already knows. Fare evasion has been around forever. It's the oldest conflict in the subway, older than half the stations on the map. But somewhere along the rails, the MTA decided the answer wasn't understanding, design, or accessibility. It was hardware. It was force. $10 million of steel and sensors and gates that promise control, but deliver something else entirely. Because now we are watching belongings get trapped between panels that don't care who you are. We're watching a woman's neck caught between doors that were supposed to make the system safer. Now we're watching children get their necks snapped off for $3. We're watching a transit agency so focused on stopping fare evasion that it forgot about the people actually using the system. Suddenly, the emergency exits that once helped disabled riders are sealed. The space that once allowed wider bodies to move freely is gone, and the grace period for anyone who walks a little slower has vanished. The message is simple. Pay quickly, move quickly, fit the mold, or get punished by machinery built to contain you. But what if I told you this goes deeper than inconvenience or bad design? What if I told you that lives were lost over a gate? That in the long, messy history of New York transit, there were moments when the subway treated a fare line like a military border, a red line you weren't allowed to cross without consequences. I'm going to tell you two stories. Two moments when a simple act, stepping past a gate, refusing a fare, challenging the system, ended with someone dead. Not because they were dangerous, not because they were armed, but because the machinery of fare enforcement was treated like something sacred. Something worth defending at any costs. These are the stories the city forgets, and the ones we're going to bring back into the light. Fare enforcement has always carried an edge of violence. It didn't start with cameras or steel gates or modern turnstiles. It's been baked into the system from the beginning. Go back to 1906, when the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company still controlled the Brighton line, the same corridor that would one day carry the B&Q. South of Neck Road, the rules were different. Riders had to pay a second fare mid-trip, and the collection didn't happen in a mezzanine or at a turnstile. You paid inside the moving trolley itself, and if you didn't, the consequences weren't a summon or fines. They were physical. That day, 2 women refused to pay that double fare while the trolley was already in motion. The conductors didn't wait for a station. They didn't slow it down. They enforced the rule the way the system was built to enforce it back then, by removing anyone who didn't comply. The trolley was moving at roughly 20 miles an hour when they were forced off, and they fell into the waters off Coney Island Creek, where they later drowned. All of this over a fare. All of this because the system treated a payment dispute like a line that could not be crossed. That's the legacy we're dealing with when we talk about fare enforcement today. But Coney Island wasn't always the broken, isolated waterway we see today. It used to be a full tidal strait, a long winding body of water that separated Coney Island from the rest of Brooklyn. It stretched from Gravesend Bay all the way towards Sheepshead Bay, carving out a natural boundary that shaped the entire southern edge of the borough. But in the early 20th century, piece by piece, the city filled it in. Marshland became landfill, water became ground, and the creek that once touched half the neighborhood slowly disappeared. Today, that eastern reach is gone. The creek no longer comes anywhere near Neck Road. The entire eastern half was buried under man-made land. And another YouTuber spoke something similar to this.
Once there was a woman who refused to pay that fare, and she was punished by getting drowned in the Coney Island Creek.
He brushed it off and immediately moved on to the next station. When I first learned from it, I couldn't let it go. I dug deeper into old maps, forgotten waterways, the histories of Brooklyn, and its rivers that were erased to make room for tracks, streets, and real estate. What I found wasn't just geography, it was the foundation for a story about how the city reshaped its land, its transit, and its people, and how those choices still echo in the tragedies we're about to talk about. A transit company in 1906 was so locked into fare enforcement that they allowed conductors to physically remove people from moving trolleys. That was the culture. That was the priority. Not safety, not humanity, just the fare. And when you look at the choices they made, the negligence, the pressure, the way they treated riders as obstacles instead of people, you start to feel something almost spiritual about the fallout. You start to understand why the energy, the karma, the unresolved violence of the BRT era started to gather and crash all at once in the Melbourne Street wreck. But that's a story for another topic. The infrastructure was unsafe. Low wooden bridges, no guardrails, marsh water waiting below. That one shove could mean the end of someone's life. And when it did happen, the worst case scenario played out exactly the way anyone could have predicted. The system just kept moving. No accountability, no reform, barely even a record that it happened. It's the kind of story that makes you stop and ask yourself, how the hell was this ever normal? The danger wasn't the fall. It was everything waiting beneath it. If you were pushed off one of those old trestles, you could hit the side of a bridge, the rocks, or the uneven ground before you even touched the water. That alone could leave you stunned or disoriented, and the creek itself wasn't some calm pool. Coney Island Creek back then was tidal, murky and unpredictable, mud that could trap you, sudden drop-offs, pockets of strong current. It was the kind of water where one mistake could turn into a crisis fast. Then there was the clothing, early 1900s skirts, coats, boots, all of it heavy, all of it ready to soak through instantly and pull you downward. You didn't get a second chance once that weight hit. And there was no rescue culture, no railings to grab, no flotation devices, no trained responders. If you went under while dazed or tangled, you were on your own. So what you're looking at is a relatively short fall into an environment that gave you no margin for error. One bad hit, one moment of confusion, one piece of clothing dragging you down, that was enough to turn it into a drowning. And that's what makes the whole thing cruel. The system didn't need massive height or a dramatic accident to make this deadly. It only needed indifference in a setup that was already dangerous by design. That is the dark energy carried by the spirit of fare evasion, a century-old pattern of punishment, indifference, and escalation that never really left the system. It just changed shape. Before I get to the second story, we need to talk about what the MTA is dealing with right now. This is the legacy of fare evasion you deserve to be warned about. Moving on. The past isn't just history, it's a blueprint. The MTA and NYPD's own data show that fare enforcement in the modern system has repeatedly escalated into physical confrontations, especially in the last few years. Their public safety updates point out that felony assaults rise sharply during periods of more aggressive fare enforcement. And when they talk about proactive enforcement of fare evasion, they list it as a contributing factor to those rising assaults. They don't name individual cases, but the pattern is unmistakable. When fare enforcement ramps up, so does violence. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about why that violence has expanded. The root cause that connects a 1906 trolley under wooden trestle to the subway platforms we stand on today. The report shows something staggering. Assaults on officers increased 152% during that same pyramid. Fare evasion enforcement intensified. That tells you everything you need to know. Even when the original issue is just a fare, the confrontation can spiral into a family feud. The pattern is baked into the system, and they are ignorantly repeating the same mistakes. And who's to say that women lost in the water didn't become something mythic in the tide? Who's to say that in some distant moment of judgment, a giant cyclops doesn't rise from the old creek bed and swallow the entire Brighton line? If you live near King's Highway, if you're one of the goons who enforce those rules without mercy, and who's to say the following video I'm about to show you isn't possible to happen to you?
You know what you have done 117 years ago.
What the hell is this guy talking about?
This city full of rats shall be washed away! Summon them!
But that's a story for another video. Moving on to the second story. One that didn't happen a century ago, but in 2024, in a city where women could vote, smartphones existed and the subway was supposed to be safer than ever. It happened on the L train platform at Sutter Avenue in Brownsville. His name was Daryl Mickles, and before he even stepped into the station, he was already in a deeply unstable and emotionally distressed state. Witnesses said he looked overwhelmed, agitated, lost in something heavy long before the officers ever approached him. He jumped the turnstile. Officers followed him up the stairs, and in his panic, he pulled out a knife and said, "I'll kill you if you keep following me." It wasn't calculated. It wasn't strategic. It was the kind of thing someone says when their mind is spiraling and they can't tell what's real anymore. But instead of slowing things down, instead of recognizing the signs of a man in crisis, the situation exploded. Officers opened fire 9 rounds in a crowded station. Mickles was struck and killed. An NYP officer was hit by friendly fire, and 2 bystanders, people who had nothing to do with any of this, were shot, including one who ended up in critical condition. All of this because a man who was already emotionally unraveling couldn't pay $2. There's no reports of how many times he was shot. The articles only confirm he was one of the 4 people injured by gunfire. So while it's tempting to assume most of the bullets hit him, the documentation simply doesn't say. And that's part of the point. A $3 fare dispute spiraled into a chaotic exchange of gunfire that injured 4 people in a crowded station. The exact wound counts aren't even recorded in the public reporting, only the pattern. Fare enforcement escalated into violence again. What happened on that platform wasn't just chaotic, it was sloppy, it was reckless, and the consequences fell on people who had nothing to do with the confrontation. A 45-year-old woman was shot, a 49-year-old in the head, surviving only after emergency surgery and suffering brain damage. Those 2 bystanders weren't criminals, they weren't involved, they were just riders. People who actually paid the fares and who were simply trying to get home. Yet they became collateral because officers were stupid enough to open fire in a crowded station. Even witnesses and family members described the shooting as very reckless. When bullets hit bystanders in the head, when a man ends up in critical condition, when a woman is struck for simply standing in the wrong place, that's not precision, that's not control. That's not professionalism. That's a system losing its grip. A system that kills over jumping the fares. And there's the part people forget. Daryl Mickles wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a headline. He wasn't a statistic. He had a family. During an interview, his aunt cried on television, not because she was defending what happened, but because she was mourning the person she knew. The person behind the moment, the person who was clearly going through something terrible that day. Tell me this man didn't have a loving family. Tell me he didn't have people who cared for him. Tell me he wasn't struggling with something heavy, something overwhelming, something that pushed him past his breaking point. Because people don't snap out of nowhere. People don't spiral for no reason. People don't threaten officers unless something inside of them has already collapsed. And instead of recognizing that, instead of slowing down, instead of de-escalating, instead of treating him like a human being in crisis, the situation exploded. Officers fired 9 rounds in a station full of commuters. They didn't contain the danger, they multiplied it. That's the part that lingers the most. The randomness. People were just trying to get home. They weren't part of the fight, the chase, or the escalation. They were simply at the wrong place in the wrong time. And suddenly their lives split into a before and an after. Moments like that remind you how thin the line is between routine and catastrophe, and how easily a system built on confrontation can turn strangers into collateral. And yet, there's a deeper layer to all of this. The part that hits harder than any bullet. They didn't respond because the man was in crisis. They didn't respond because he was unraveling or overwhelmed or carrying something heavier from earlier that day. They responded because he hopped the fare. That was the trigger, not his state of mind, not his safety, not whatever pain or chaos he might have been walking around with. He could have lost a family member. He could have had the worst argument or fight of his life. He could have been spiraling, scared, or desperate. But none of that mattered in the moment. No one asked how he was feeling. No one tried to understand what pushed him to that point. The only thing that mattered, the only thing that activated the system was that he jumped the turnstile. And suddenly that tiny act turns into a 75-star wanted level. A full tactical response over $3. $3 in that exact moment, which changes nothing. $3 that wouldn't fix the budget, stabilize the system, or make the station safer. $3 that became the difference between being ignored and being pursued. And there's something you have to understand about people who are crazy or mentally ill in New York City. Most of the time, they're not dangerous or plotting anything. They're not looking for a fight. They're people carrying layers of trauma, grief, and pressure that the rest of the city never sees. They speak from wounds instead of intentions. They react from pain instead of strategy. On the train, they can seem intimidating at first. The raised voice, the pacing, the muttering, but anyone who rides the subway long enough knows the rhythm. They move through the car, maybe say something sharp or chaotic, and then they drift on to the next one. The moment passes, the energy dissolves, no one gets hurt. From the perspective of a New York passenger, this is everyday life. It's background noise. It's the city breathing. But trauma is unpredictable. If someone in that state feels threatened, mocked, concerned, or misunderstood, they can lash out not because they're violent by nature, but because they're overwhelmed and unprotected. Their nervous system is already in a survival mode. One wrong word, one wrong gesture, and the situation can flip. And this is where the system breaks down. Police aren't trained to understand that perspective. The internal storm, the emotional overload, the way trauma shapes behavior. So when officers confront someone who's unstable or distressed, it's easy for them to default towards fear. It's easy for them to say they felt threatened. It's easy for the encounter to escalate, not because the person was inherently dangerous, but because the system only knows how to respond with violence. There's a reason people do this, a reason that has nothing to do with crime for the vast majority of riders. Fare evasion isn't some ground scheme of rebellion. Most of the time, it's survival. It's exhaustion. It's people trying to get to work without sinking deeper into a hole they didn't dig. Some riders genuinely can't afford the fare. Not because they're irresponsible, but because the math of living in New York has stopped making sense. If they drive, they're trapped in traffic somewhere along Atlantic Avenue, burning gas they can't afford. If they take the train, they're staring at a turnstile that demands money they don't have. People don't have the financial cushion they once did. $7 becomes the difference between getting to work and buying an extra pack of meat that might stretch the week a little further. So when someone hops a turnstile, it's not always defiance. It's not always disrespect nor criminal intent. It's a calculation made under pressure. It's someone choosing between two necessities and hoping the city understands. But the system doesn't understand. It sees the act instead of the circumstances, the jump instead of the struggle, the fear instead of the person. And that disconnect, that gap between lived reality and institutional response is where everything begins to break. The MTA keeps talking about these giant new fare gates like there's some kind of solution. But anyone who actually rides the system knows what they really are. Another obstacle, another slowdown, another way to make it harder for people to get to work on time. And the irony is almost painful. The people who rely on transit the most are the ones who will feel it first. Because here's the truth, most New Yorkers don't have the luxury of a car waiting in the driveway. And even the ones who do know it's not a real alternative. Driving in this city is a punishment. Gas prices have doubled since 2020. Insurance is a maze of rising premiums and unpredictable drivers. And if you live anywhere near Atlantic Avenue, the Times Square of Brooklyn, Jackson Heights, or West Harlem, you already know what traffic feels like. An hour to go a few miles, a crawl that eats your day alive. That's why transit isn't optional here, it's survival in the bloodstream of the city. But MTA keeps acting like everyone has a backup plan. Like everyone can just switch to driving if the gates slow things down. Like the system isn't carrying millions of people who are already stretched thin. 60% of New Yorkers are living in low-income situations, juggling rent, groceries, bills, and whatever crisis the week throws at them. And now they're supposed to navigate airport-style gates just to get to work? And if the fare goes up once again, the people who can't pay won't just be slowed down. They'll be shut out. They won't be able to take long-distance commutes, won't be able to reach the jobs that keep the city alive. And when you start cutting people off from mobility, you're not just hurting individuals, you're weakening the entire economy of New York. Most of the country can fall back on cars. 92% of United States households own one. But New York is different. Here, transit is the lifeline. It's the bloodstream of the city. Car ownership is low because it has to be. The streets can't handle everyone driving and the costs are brutal. So when the MTA acts like everyone has a backup plan, it feels disconnected from reality. And then there's the cost of simply existing in this system. $7 for a round trip doesn't sound like much until you do it every day, until you're commuting 5 days a week, until you're supporting a family. $7 a day adds up to $210 a month just to show up to work. 2 round trips a day becomes someone's quarter rent. A quarter of groceries, a quarter of stability, and that's unacceptable. Especially when fares aren't even the backbone of the MTA's budget anymore. In the 90s, fares made up nearly half of their income. Today, it's closer towards under a quarter. The system doesn't survive because riders tap their Omni or MetroCards. It survives because the region funds it. So why are riders being squeezed like they're the financial lifeline? New York doesn't run on fares, it runs on people. And every barrier the MTA builds pushes those people further away from the city they're trying to hold together. The MTA needs a new kind of fare system, one that actually reflects the reality of the city it serves. Not a one-price-fits-all model, but a system that understands the economic landscape of New York. A system where the cost of a ride depends on the community around it. In the wealthier parts of the city, the tourist quarters, the business districts, the places where money flows freely, the fare could stay at $3.50 or even rise. Those riders can absorb it. Those neighborhoods can handle it. But middle-class areas shouldn't be paying the same price. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, if you're juggling rent and groceries and childcare, a $3.50 fare hits differently. Dropping it to $2.50 or even $2 in those neighborhoods would ease the pressure without starving the system. And in the lowest income areas, the projects, the neighborhoods where poverty isn't a statistic but a daily reality, areas where you're desperate enough to snatch food away from somebody, the fare should be $1, maybe even 75 cents. Something small enough that people don't have to choose between getting to work and eating dinner. Something humane. Because that's the real point. This kind of system would take the weight off people's minds. It would stop forcing riders to constantly calculate whether they can afford to move through their own city. It would make paying the fare feel possible instead of punishing. And when the price feels fair, people are far more likely to pay it. A sliding scale fare wouldn't just change how people travel, it would change how they breathe, plan, and survive. It would turn the subway back into what it was always meant to be, A public good, not a financial test. You can see exactly where this kind of fare reform would matter most. Not in the glossy parts of the city, but in the neighborhoods that carry New York on their backs. In the Bronx, places like Fordham, Soundview, Mott Haven, Melrose, Morrisana, and Hunts Point would immediately feel the impact. These are communities where people ride the train because they have to, not because it's convenient. Where every dollar has a job before it even reaches their hands. A lower fare wouldn't just help, but change the rhythm of daily lives. Brooklyn tells the same story. Bushwick, Brownsville, East New York, the quieter corners of Bed-Stuy, even parts of Coney Island. In Queens, the pattern repeats. South Jamaica, Long Island City, Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, the far edges of the Rockaways, places where long communities are a fact of life. Where people spend more time on trains than at home, where a high fare becomes a tax on survival. Fare should never climb to $200 or $300 a month. They should never reach $400 just because you travel with friends or family. No one should have to choose between mobility and stability. A city that depends on transit should make transit accessible. A city that runs on working people should make it possible for them to move. Lower fares aren't a luxury. It's a bigger chance of survival, and the neighborhoods that need them most have been waiting far too long. If the MTA keeps moving blindly down this path, refusing to listen, refusing to act, refusing to adopt, refusing to see the people who actually ride their system, then they're walking straight into their own collapse. They'll take a revenue stream that already sits around 20% and grind it down to 8%. They'll hollow out their own budget. They'll trigger layoffs, service cuts, and a slow slide towards something that looks uncomfortably close to the fiscal crisis of the 70s. If they install these gates on all 472 stations, they're not just spending money, they're burning it. $3.5 billion on barriers, $3.5 billion on metal and motors instead of service, safety, or affordability. $3.5 billion drained from the system, only to later turn around and beg for more while raising fares on the very riders they're pushing away. And who gets hurt first? The 60% of New Yorkers who can't afford rising prices, the people who rely on transit because they have no other choice, and the workers who keep the city alive. It feels like the MTA is drifting into something unrecognizable. Not a transit authority, but a kind of empire like a Roblox server run by admins who only care about control. A place where punishment comes before understanding, where every rider is treated like a millionaire dodging responsibility. Greed has crept in quietly, and now it's steering the ship. The MTA doesn't even realize it's been conquered by its own obsession with revenue, its own fear of fare evasion, its own belief that more barriers will somehow fix what's already broken. Barriers don't fix a city, people do. And the more the MTA forgets that, the more it becomes the very thing it claims to fight. A system that takes without giving, that punishes without listening, that mistakes force for progress. And then the end of the MetroCard isn't just a technology upgrade. It's a quiet removal of one of the last tools riders had to control their own money. For decades, the MetroCard lets you budget in the real world. You could load $20, $40, or $75 and stretch it across the week. You could see your balance. You could hold it in your hand. You could trust it. But starting in 2026, that system disappears. The MTA will stop selling and refilling MetroCards after December 31st of 2025. And that's where the cracks start to show. All those 3 trips a day routines, all those $75 balances people use to stretch across a week, all those moments where you could physically see how much you had left. And now it doesn't add up anymore. Omni doesn't give you the same sense of control. It doesn't let you budget away a physical card did. The MetroCard wasn't perfect, but it was equal. It worked for everyone. It didn't care if your phone died. It didn't care if your bank declined to tap. It didn't care if you were a technology geek or not. And now the city is losing that. Not because riders wanted it gone, but because the MTA decided modernization mattered more than accessibility. And this marks the end of my video. The final video of this entire year. We've had a crazy journey and I continue to expand it. MTA gave us the Christmas nobody asked for.